Thank you, Madam Mayor. I first met Leila at the French Institute in the winter of 2011. There was a discussion that evening about French schools in London, and as there was a large number of French residents in the borough, I was invited by a friend and attended. Upon learning I was a Camden councillor, the first words Leila said to me was, "Where is Lorraine?" Because she was expecting to see Lorraine Riva, who at the time was the cabinet member for children's schools and families. Once having finally met her, I was seeing her everywhere, and I was hearing her everywhere. We would lock horns when, as part of the Abacus campaign, along with Councillor Simon, she was trying to open up a new school in the territorial barracks at the bottom of Fitzjohn's Avenue. At that time, we locked horns, and I always had the impression she was rather unimpressed with me. A few weeks later, I met her on the street at the corner of Finchley Road and Goldhurst Terrace. It was also where I met her mother and her son. We started talking amiably. I was expecting her to almost, have a go at me and said it was a friendly chat. And she expressed an interest in politics. And I said, as a joke, if you're going to get into politics, I demand a right of first refusal. It was a joke because at that point there, her reputation was being more on the left politically. And she had been a member of the Labour Party and, of course, worked closely with the Liberal Democrats. But much to my surprise, a few days later, she reached out to me with a message, Gio, that right of first refusal, let's talk. We met at the Oliver's Cafe in Belsize Lane, and we started to have a conversation. We talked about our lives, our values, our beliefs. And as the conversation went on, I realized that she was much more a natural conservative than most people, herself included, realized. I almost had to tell her, Leila, you realize for what you're saying, you are a Tory. As a matter of fact, in some issues, like she was much more to the right than me. She wanted to reopen poorhouses. And I said, that's impossible. I was horrified at the very thought. The cafe closed. We went for a walk, continuing to talk about it all. And at one point, then she buckled over because her heart had given her a slight problem. I did not realize there and then that in addition to finally getting to know this person, I was also meeting her scourge. Over the next few weeks, she would start showing up at conservative events, much to the horror, I should say, of certain members who remembered her as this vaguely lefty, indefatigable campaigner for school places. She was a particular nightmare of Councillor Andrew Muneer, who had the cabinet member for education during the partnership administration. You could only imagine what he felt when all of a sudden one of his tormentors was starting to show up at regular conservative events. She joined the Conservative Party the day after the mayoral election of 2012. And from that point onwards, she became a regular member. She would become a council candidate for Gospel Oak in 2013, and then a candidate and finally a councillor in Belsize in 2014. Leila was a constant campaigner. She would never stop. She would never be quiet. She would never surrender. She was a child of privilege. Her father was a diplomat and actually royalty from the Republic of Benin. I don't know how republic and royalty coincide, but that was the case. Her education had been some of the best education in the world. And she could have chosen a very easy life, but she had refused that. She refused the easy life and instead moved on to make her own way in the world, which is how she ended up first in a council estate in Bacton Rise, and then from then on to a garden flat in Savile Lake Road. She was a person of compassion, of empathy, of fierce loyalty, of civic solidarity, although she was always skeptical of pauperism as a virtue. She was impossible to ignore. She was loud, boisterous, able to strike a conversation with anyone, to total strangers telling her life stories 5 minutes after they met her. And she would never take no for an answer. She would never tolerate any BS from any of her friends and had no compunctions in kicking them in the rear end. And I'm not talking figuratively, I'm talking literally. I have bruises to prove that. She could be fiery. Her bluntness could spark rows. I always thought you can't really call yourself a friend of Leila's if you haven't sworn to never speak to her again at least once a year. Council officers laboured her a vexatious complainer, and that for her was a badge of pride, and she wore it. I can only imagine what those officers thought when finally they saw her as a councillor in Camden. After her time in Camden, she started to work for the International Democracy Foundation, working extensively in Africa. She was going to bring democracy single-handedly to that continent, and if there was ever one person who would have done that, that would have been her. And during COVID, she set up the Invicta Foundation to help kids who needed to catch up the education that they had lost during the COVID. But for all her passion, for all her civic mindedness, for all her involvement, the one true love of her life was her son, Anton. And for him, she would do and did anything and everything. And for him and for his education, his opportunities, it's to ensure that not just his opportunities for a better education and thus a better life, but those of everyone else, that she became such a fierce education campaigner. I want to say enough. I want to say to her, basta, se. This trick you're playing on us is over. You've done it. You've convinced us all, okay? You get to see what we're saying about you, Leila, now that you've passed away. But this trick is over now. It's getting scary, and I want you to stop, please. But she's stubborn, and she's not listening. She's every bit as stubborn now as she was all along. I'm glad that tonight, instead of the minute of silence, we're going to be loud. We're going to make noise. Because life is noise. Life is sound. And Leila was so full of life and so full of noise, so full of sound. And it's good that we celebrate her that way. Not silence. She was never silent a minute in her life. Ma amie Leila, nous n'entendrons jamais plus avec nos oreilles, mais nous t'entendrons toujours dans notre cœur. My beloved Leila, we will never hear you again with our ears, but we'll always hear you in our hearts. Adieu.